Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm Richard Nta in Nairobi. Here's what's ahead. International aid arrives in Tonga following Saturday's deadly volcanic eruption and tsunami. And U.S. President Joe Biden reflects on his first year in office, focusing on COVID and foreign policy. And the WHO Africa office gives an update on the COVID-19 situation on the continent. Once again, welcome to The World Today. I'm Richard Nta. Let's begin with China's aid to Tonga. China has delivered aid to Tonga as the country reels from last week's catastrophic eruption. The Chinese embassy delivered food and drinking water to the Tongan government on Wednesday. It's the first round of international aid received by the South Pacific nation. Earlier, Tonga's ambassador to China, Tua Aika Utaatu, told CGTN China had donated $100,000 in humanitarian aid to the disaster-stricken island nation. Well, humanitarian aid and disaster relief are trickling in for tsunami-hit Tonga. Supplies from Australia and New Zealand arrived Thursday. A huge volcanic eruption and tsunami on Saturday had cut off the island. Telephone services have now been restored, though it may take a month or so for full internet connectivity. The United Nations says over 80% of the population have been badly affected. Owen Paulin has more.
After a 5-day communications blackout, limited telephone contact has now been established with Tonga after an emergency 2G satellite service was set up. However, it's very unstable and provides only around 10% of Tonga's usual service. The biggest need right now is for drinking water because the toxic ash has contaminated Tonga's water supplies. And of course, clearing ash from the runway at Tonga's main international airport has been a major priority so that planes can start bringing in aid. At one stage earlier this week, around 200 workers were photographed physically sweeping the ash off the runway. And the good news is that the airport is now finally open and the first airlift of emergency supplies has now arrived from New Zealand in a C-130 Hercules aircraft. That's been quickly followed by the first of 2 New Zealand Navy vessels, which will bring vital equipment, including satellite phones, to open up communication lines with the outer islands, which have been hard hit by this disaster. Another ship is on its way from Australia, and of course China is also standing by to fly in disaster relief equipment. The Tongan government says the last thing it needs is a tsunami of COVID-19 entering the country because of the international relief effort. So New Zealand has agreed to a contactless disaster relief arrangement where supplies will be pretty much left on the ground for locals to collect. But at least the aid is now getting through. Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
Around 20 International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society staff are currently working in Tonga to help the country's disaster relief efforts. And on Wednesday, they finally got in touch with the Pacific head of the delegation in Fiji, Katie Greenwood. During an interview with CGTN's Yu Young, Ms. Greenwood shared with us the latest on Tonga's situation, as well as the IFRC's disaster relief work on the ground.
Well, the runway being open and able to accept flights in with essential relief items is one of the very good news stories of this disaster response. We had hundreds of volunteers come out and manually clear the runway of debris and ash to ensure that those flights could land. And we understand that right about now, there's the first flight landing with relief items coming in from New Zealand. And that includes additional fresh water supplies and the technology to pump out clean water for whole communities. But it hasn't all been good news. Of course, there's some devastating news from those outer islands and low-lying atolls that are closer to the eruption. And the news from there is that all the houses have been lost, all of the infrastructure has been lost on some of those islands. So just devastating for those people. There will need to be a short, medium and long-term strategy around shelter for people in Tonga. So we know that somewhere between 100 and 200 families have lost everything. They've had their homes washed away. And so for those people, currently some of those people are staying with friends and relatives in makeshift accommodation. Some people have been evacuated from the smaller outer-lying islands to one of the larger islands and again are staying with friends and relatives there. But that can only last for a short period of time. And so for those people, we will need tents, we will need these shelter kits for rebuilding, we will need probably a cash program to support those families that are hosting additional members, and we will need a longer-term strategy in cooperation with the Tongan government about what they would like to do to build back better, which is so important, particularly in the Pacific Islands that are affected by things like climate change. We have a reasonably small office in Tonga at the Tongan Red Cross. They have around about 20 staff, but they have over 100 really well-trained and experienced disaster response volunteers, which is fantastic. We also had pre-positioned relief supplies in country ready to go, which has been so essential to this response. 1,200 families immediately able to access really important relief items like fresh water, like blankets, like lanterns for the power outages that they've been experiencing. We've got tools available for people and tarpaulins to make those necessary temporary measures that they need to do to shore up their homes. So they're a good experienced team, and we always knew that even though we couldn't speak to them on the ground for that short period of time we were out of contact, that they would be very active in doing all the things that they needed to do. Indeed, when we first spoke to the team and made contact with them at the end of the call, I asked the Secretary General of the Red Cross there if he had any other essential messages he needed me to relay to anyone. And he said, please just tell the world we're here, we're doing our job, we're serving the people of Tonga and providing all the relief that is needed for people who've been affected. And it was quite an emotional call, as you can imagine. Communication is still a big issue on the ground, even though we are able to speak with our team and they are able to speak together locally. Some communication is back up and running. The undersea cable that has been damaged, that fibre optic cable, is going to take weeks, if not up to a month or so, to actually repair. So before Tonga can be fully restored to its full communication power, and data able to come in and out of the country, that is still a big challenge when you're trying to coordinate a major disaster response.
The World Health Organization African Regional Office is right now giving a briefing on the state of the pandemic on the continent. Cases have surpassed 10 million with nearly 250,000 deaths. The World Health Organization says that the Omicron fuel surge in cases on the continent is now plateauing. At least 30 African countries have reported the presence of the latest strain. Let's listen in.
They are highly relevant to the design and implementation of a test and treat strategy for COVID-19. First, political commitment is crucial in order to create an environment that's conducive to the development of appropriate policy, operational guidelines, and protocols that are in line with scientific evidence and international guidelines. Second, engaging communities is critically important. We've learned that in order to reach populations most severely impacted by HIV, it is important to understand their needs and preferences. As HIV programs have evolved, it's become clear that one size does not fit all, and that services should be adapted based on client preferences so that they are acceptable and accessible.
Thousands of barrels of oil have leaked into Peru's beaches after the tsunami in Tonga. The Peruvian government is now demanding compensation from the Spanish oil giant Repsol. It says the spill is an, quote, ecological disaster, close quote. 3 beaches were sealed off on Monday after 6,000 barrels of oil leaked from Repsol, which is located off the coast near Lima. Repsol officials say they're working with authorities to clean up the beaches, which are now littered with carcasses of dead birds, fish, and other species. Peruvian prosecutors are investigating the company for environmental contamination. Well, news just in, at least 30 people are feared dead as a result of a stampede at a religious crusade in Liberia's New Crew town. The incident reportedly occurred when attackers ambushed worshipers and injured them with crude weapons, including machetes. Now, some of those trying to escape the incident were caught up in the deadly stampede. Among the casualties include 17 women, 11 children, and 3 men. And in other news, the Ukraine tension weighs heavy on U.S. President Joe Biden, who has marked his first year in office. Taking questions from a media in a rare solo news conference, he talked about progress in various areas, but much of his agenda is still stalled in Congress. Caroline Malone reports from Washington.
Well, Biden spoke on a wide number of issues, and starting with foreign policy. He said on Russia it would be a disaster for Moscow to further invade Ukraine. There would be significant harm on the Russian economy. There would be cost of loss of life that would be heavy, and President Putin has a choice of diplomacy instead. Now, to the US economy, he said, well, there's been record job creation in the United States. There's been support for medical bills and managing the prices on those. And the infrastructure bill that he has managed to pass has meant that there's funding for roads and bridges and also drinking water pipes and for the internet. But of course, there is the issue of inflation at a 40-year high. He said it would be appropriate for the Federal Reserve to increase those interest rates later in the year. Now, Omicron is still causing a problem in the United States, but Biden said that vaccines are a big tool that are helping. 75% of the population now vaccinated here, and there are COVID-19 pills to help treat people. Let's hear more of what he had to say on that.
I know there's a lot of frustration and fatigue in this country. And we know why. COVID-19, Omicron has now been challenging us in a way that it's the new enemy. But while it's cause for concern, it's not cause for panic.
Well, looking forward, Biden said he does see a number of his future bills potentially helping. He's trying to push still the Build Back Better plan. That's the social and climate bill that he's been trying to get through Congress for many months. He said even getting parts of that bill passed would particularly help with childcare. It could get more women back into the workforce who left during the COVID-19 pandemic. He said it would help with drug prices, then decreasing the prices there. And overall, it would actually reduce the deficit and ease inflation rather than some of the concerns that people have that it would do the opposite. He said he's confident he will get the Build Back Better plan signed. And he is also confident that there will be some progress on voting rights bill as well. Of course, the midterms later this year in the United States, that's going to be an important time to see if there's further support for the Democrats or if they lose some of those seats in Congress. Caroline Malone, CGTN, Washington.
Well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
allies to help it survive sanctions instituted by regional bloc ECOWAS. Results from clinical trials in South Africa trigger calls to rework vaccines to deal with Omicron. And a look at the crisis of Africa's illegal immigrants as tens of thousands of Zimbabweans are deported. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. The International Monetary Fund calls on the public and private creditors to complete a renegotiation of Chad's loans by the end of March. And in sports, Nigeria and Egypt go through to the last 16 of the ongoing Africa Cup of Nations in Cameroon. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. Great to have you along with us for this hour. A reminder of that story breaking out of Liberia. 29 people are confirmed dead as a result of a stampede at a religious crusade in Liberia's New Crew town. The incident reportedly occurred when attackers ambushed worshipers and injured them with crude weapons, including machetes. Some of those trying to escape the incident were caught up in the deadly stampede. Among the casualties include 17 women, 11 children, and 3 men. And let's turn our attention to Mali, where the country has been approaching neighbors Guinea and Mauritania as it seeks allies after the West African Regional Bloc, ECOWAS, imposed sanctions. A large delegation went to Conakry and another to Nouakchott to discuss ways to ease the movement of people and goods. Mali is trying to ensure normal supplies as ECOWAS sanctions are expected to plunge the country into a financial crisis. The European Union has also announced that it will impose sanctions on Mali in line with measures already taken by the bloc. Decisions are likely by the end of January. Meanwhile, Mali authorities have banned a German military plane with 75 troops on board from overflying the country late on Wednesday. And in Gambia, President Adama Barrow has been sworn in following his re-election for a second term. In his inaugural speech Wednesday, Barrow promised to work towards building consensus for the establishment of a new constitution. The Gambian leader won about 53% of the vote in the December election, beating his main contender, Ousseino Darboe, who received about 28% of the vote. The vote was the country's first presidential election in decades that did not include former leader Yahya Jammeh.
In 2016, our objective was to liberate the people from oppression and injustice. It was a call for change, and indeed, change has come about. Today, the Gambia of the past giving way to a new democratic Gambia, where every citizen is equal before the law. The independence of the judiciary is unquestionable, and Gambians have confidence in our judicial system. This is what the people fought for, and this is what they have chosen to sustain. All Gambians, let us embrace the culture of peace and peaceful coexistence as one Gambian family for our betterment and for those unborn.
The Western Cape High Court has overturned an order by a lower court to send the man accused of setting South Africa's Houses of Parliament alight for psychiatric observation for a period of 1 month. The High Court ruled that the accused, who had said that there was nothing wrong with him, be released from the psychiatric hospital and returned to Cape Town's infamous Paulsmoor prison. Renee Delcaram has more.
The Western Cape High Court ruled that the decision by the Cape Town Magistrates Court to refer the accused for 30 days psychiatric evaluation had been improper, and said any further detention of the accused at the psychiatric facility would be unlawful. The judge-president said it should never have happened and ordered that the accused be placed in a normal correctional facility with immediate effect.
Today, I am saying wheels of justice are grinding even faster than Saturday. In that, we have been pleading and crying for justice. Today, the court has set aside the order, the unlawful order, which was made by the magistrate court on the 11th. So something like this is something which should never happen even in future.
We accept the decision of the court, we accept the order, we will abide by the order, which sets aside the referral of the accused. The accused says he's fine. The lawyer says the accused is fine, although in court they said they were not doctors, but they still say he's fine, there's nothing wrong with him.
The accused senior counsel claimed that the state was trying to turn him into a modern-day Tsefendis, referring to the South African assassin Dimitri Tsefendis, a parliamentary messenger who had stabbed the then apartheid Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd to death inside Parliament. Tsefendis was found unfit to stand trial for reasons of insanity.
Day one, we said this is unfair. The procedure which was followed, it goes down to the fairness of the trial. For now, one thing we know, that's contravention of his rights by looking at him and say, no, you have a mental condition. The Act says everyone is presumed not to have a mental problem.
Accused who faces charges of terrorism, arson, housebreaking and theft will be remanded in prison until the 22nd of January, when his bail application will finally be heard. Renee Dalkam, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Nearly 2,500 Sudanese living in Israel are now enjoying their status as temporary residents following a high court ruling in April. The asylum seekers have been granted most rights given to Israeli citizens aside from voting rights. Here is CGTN's Wanja Mungai with the story.
Meet Sabona Mohammed Hassan, who escaped the Darfur conflict in Sudan that erupted in 2003. At just 8 years old, he was separated from his family while fleeing unrest. He arrived in Israel in 2010, where he has been living in immigration limbo while surviving on menial work.
I have nothing to eat. I have nothing to, sleeping here like 2 months was so crazy. And I said, what I'm doing here? That was so crazy moment. This is when I first entered into Israel. I want to visit my mom. This is the one of the important kids. So like 18 years. So I've been like each of 8 years old until now. I couldn't tell my family members.
Hassan now hopes that his situation will change, as he is one of hundreds of Sudanese asylum seekers who have been granted temporary resident status in Israel. Human rights attorney Carmel Pomeranz said previously authorities had been handing out the visas in smaller numbers. However, the Israeli High Court prompted the government to heed to its obligation under national and international law.
That is a game changer in Israeli refugee law and in Israeli, even in administrative law.
Authorities say the new immigration status given will be in effect until a decision is made on asylum requests. Migrants from Sudan's Darfur, Blue Nile, and Nuba Mountains will be able to conduct business, secure healthcare, and even travel abroad. A welcome change that could enable those like Hassan to finally start living. Wanjamungai, CGTN.
Our coverage continues on Africa Live. We will see you on the other side of the break with more news stories. Here's what's ahead. In South Africa, billionaire businessman opens vaccine plant to address Africa's lack of manufacturing capacity. And Zimbabwe struggles to stem illegal immigration to neighboring South Africa. Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. A World Health Organization technical body says that the current COVID-19 vaccines may need to be reworked to ensure they are effective against Omicron and future variants of the coronavirus. Preliminary findings from 2 South African clinical trials suggest the Omicron coronavirus variant has a much higher rate of asymptomatic carriage than earlier variants, which could explain why it has spread so rapidly across the globe. CGTN's Ulysses Jamela has more.
The Omicron variant of COVID-19, which was first discovered here in South Africa, has so far resulted in fewer deaths and hospitalizations than other waves. But according to health experts, this does not mean that the Omicron variant is a less virulent strain of the virus.
When we first looked at it, we were actually quite dismayed as virologists. We thought this is going to be a really bad one. And in fact, the opposite has been the case. It has all these mutations, but what these mutations have done to the virus is they've made it a lot more transmissible, in other words, more infectious, more contagious. So it's spread very much more rapidly. So we've had about, in terms of number of cases, about 2 or 3 times the number of cases that we had in the second wave and in the third wave. So it's spread much more rapidly. But on the and also the one other thing which was interesting is that the vaccines weren't quite as effective. So a lot of people that had been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, were still getting infected, despite being vaccinated. The good part of it was that this Omicron variant tended to cause a very much more mild illness.
The professor says the Omicron variant that has driven the 4th wave here has been largely contained, mostly due to protection conferred by prior infection or vaccination.
It's been very effective in terms of preventing severe disease, very effective. When I say that, I mean 85, 95% effective. When it comes to the milder illness or just infection without any symptoms, what we call asymptomatic infection, not quite so good, particularly with Omicron, less so than with the other variants. So there it drops to about 60, maybe 70%, but not much more than that. And that's why we've heard of so many cases of people getting infection in spite of vaccination.
Professor Shub also says while vaccination offers protection against severe Omicron infections and hospitalization, booster shots may still be necessary.
What has been noticed is that the vaccine, after a while, the immunity, according to laboratory testing, and I must stress that, tends to drop, it tends to wane. And this is about 6-7 months after the course of vaccination. So quite early on, countries around the world, and of course in South Africa as well, we decided to boost that immunity after 6 months. Now, how effective it is, that is still being worked out.
The discovery of the Omicron strain about 8 weeks ago triggered alarm that it could cause another surge in global infections. It also led many countries to impose travel restrictions on the Southern Africa region. Ulysses Jamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Africa has entered a new era of health sciences. The establishment of Africa's Access to Advanced Healthcare Coalition brings together several sectors of society to advance the continent's pharmaceutical and medical capabilities. It includes a state-of-the-art vaccine manufacturing campus that will develop the next generation of COVID-19 and cancer vaccines. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
South Africa stamped its name in history as a new vaccine plant was opened in Cape Town.
Just within the walls of this facility here, that would appear to be empty, but which is about to be filled with high-tech machines, manufacturing capability, that we will be able to have advanced skills that will be developed, and through other initiatives across our continent, that our vision for vaccine, diagnostics, as well as drug manufacturing in Africa will soon take form.
The groundbreaking investment by South African-born tech billionaire Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong will enable the development of second-generation COVID-19 vaccines that destroy the virus and prevents it from being transmitted.
We have now developed this SNN T-cell vaccine as a second-generation vaccine, and we want to manufacture this in Africa, for Africa, and export it to the world.
This investment sparks a new era in Africa's pharmaceutical manufacturing landscape. No longer will the continent have to rely on the help of others to take care of its own people.
Africa should no longer go cap in hand to the Western world, begging and begging for vaccines that they just want to drip off from their tables. We will stand on our own.
95% of pharmaceutical products used on the African continent are imported.
This is what so many organizations and the African Union, African CDC governments have been working for. May we never be in a situation again where the world gets vaccinated, and even today, 2 years into the pandemic, only 8% of the African population have been vaccinated.
It's not just about this facility, but it's the level of investment that's happening in science and technology in South Africa. And I think that's very important to have a little bit what China did in the past, to have all the process that from identification to production of biologics, and that's the idea that South Africa is trying to do now.
This facility aims to produce 1 billion doses annually by 2025, bringing hope not only in the fight against COVID-19, but in time for cancer, TB and HIV treatments. Julie Shara, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Tens of thousands of Zimbabweans have been arrested and deported from South Africa for trying to enter the country illegally. A shortage of jobs has forced many Zimbabweans to seek employment opportunities in the country's southern neighbor. However, as the South African government tightens immigration rules, many may be forced back home. CGTN's Brian Wakatuya caught up with a recent returnee who is making a new life after more than a decade away.
Vimbai Munetsi worked in South Africa's telecommunications industry for nearly 13 years. He lost his job when the COVID-19 pandemic began and came back home to try his hand at a new profession.
Last year I managed to grow maize. I managed to grow maize. And this year I said, no, let me just try another crop like this tobacco. Also, I want to try to grow sugar beans and soya beans. I did my research, so I didn't want to go back and look for work again. So I think farming is gonna sustain me, even for my family, like what I was doing in South Africa.
Over the past 2 decades, Zimbabweans have left the country in droves in search of greener pastures. The government is undertaking reforms to address the long-running economic challenges. The impact of those efforts is yet to be felt by many here who are still attempting to make the journey across the border to South Africa using any means necessary. Thousands of Zimbabweans have recently been arrested for trying to enter South Africa illegally, including swimming across the Limpopo River.
I think that it's more risky to cross the border to South Africa because of xenophobia and all that. Understandable. But the risk is much higher of staying at home and struggling to survive. It's not like it's going to be easy in South Africa, but there is no hope. So the only hope they have is to try and cross the border and experiment a new life elsewhere.
Special permits for about 250,000 Zimbabweans in South Africa will not be renewed at the end of the year. Many of them will be forced to return.
It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because life there in South Africa is totally different here in Zimbabwe. What I'm thinking for the government to do is like what happened to me. A telephone technician coming from South Africa retrenched again, and I managed to be one of the beneficiaries into farming. I think they have to initiate those farming skills. I think it's going to be better, and then they provide land for the people who are going to come back.
There is an already lengthy waiting list for farmland, so government may not be able to avail any, which means other opportunities for returnees to make a living will need to be created soon. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Concession, Zimbabwe.
Many experts in Africa support Chinese President Xi Jinping's view on multilateralism. President Xi echoed the need for international cooperation and integration during an online gathering of the World Economic Forum's Davos agenda on Monday. Ethiopian economist Ndalcheku Sime has described Xi's speech as timely.
The speech categorically mentioned there is the need for bridging this development divide. And obviously, when it comes to the sub-Saharan African countries, as far as there is a very mutual respect and partnership with the West, this development divide is possible to bridge the gap that's widening from time to time. From the Chinese perspective, they are consistently promoting the open-up policy from time to time, based upon their own internal strengths and priorities. We appreciate that. This is opening a very good window of opportunity for sub-Saharan African countries, at least to confront unfairness and the way the Westerns are perceiving the role of the sub-Saharan African countries in the global economy involves a lot of unfair treatments.
The news continues on Africa Live. We've got our business segment coming up next. Here's a peek at the headlines. The International Monetary Fund calls on public and private creditors to complete a renegotiation of Chad's loans by the end of March. Easing restrictions breathe a sigh of relief into most companies. We look at Egypt's Nile Air. Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. The UK's Department of International Trade is hosting the second edition of the Africa Investment Conference on Thursday. The conference will mark 2 years from the UK Africa Investment Summit hosted in London by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, where more than 24 trade and investment deals were announced. Here's CGTN's Nick Mondima with more.
The UK is set to host the second edition of the Africa Investment Conference with focus on boosting trade and investments in green energy on the continent. The conference marks 2 years from the UK Africa Investment Summit hosted in London, where 27 trade and investment deals worth $8.9 billion and further commitments worth $12.1 billion were announced.
The many investors see Africa as risky, and I think the perception of risk is probably much higher than the actual risk itself. So we have all those Fitch and Standard & Poor's and their ratings, but I think we need to step back and ask those who have been doing business, who are taking the long view on the continent, what are their returns and what is the actual risk?
The summit will also showcase emerging opportunities across Africa, including in clean growth solutions, highlighting UK expertise. It will explore inclusive, sustainable and resilient investment opportunities and will highlight UK government support that is available to business. The conference will make the case for strengthened closer collaboration and partnership between the UK and Africa, showcasing emerging opportunities across the continent and UK capability and expertise. The UK Department for International Trade is prioritizing building strong trading relationships in Africa, which have the potential to create, diversify and protect investment opportunities. The UK has so far signed 9 trade agreements with 17 African countries and ensured continued market access for the majority of the remaining African nations through the UK's Generalised Scheme of Preferences. A memorandum of understanding with the African Continental Free Trade Area has also been signed, the first of its kind with the non-African country. Some of the sectors that will be on the agenda include advanced manufacturing, aerospace, automotive, creative industries, energy, financial and professional services, food and drink, life sciences, retail and technology. It follows an increased effort across government to facilitate UK-Africa trade, including the UK Export Finance. The UK's Export Credit Agency has significantly increased support for markets in Africa in the past year, from approximately £600 million or $817 million in 2018-2019 to over £2.3 billion or $3.1 billion in 2020-21, supporting a range of infrastructure projects in countries like Cote d'Ivoire to Uganda. The Africa Investment Conference aligns with the UK's aims to promote trade and investment as a driver of economic growth that can trigger positive changes in a country's economy, helping to raise incomes, create jobs, and lift people out of poverty. It is said to bring together over 4,000 registered delegates for a series of panel discussions and matchmaking opportunities, and represents the lasting legacy of the UK Africa Investment Summit hosted in London by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Last year's virtual conference was attended by over 2,800 delegates from over 40 African countries and across the UK. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
The International Monetary Fund is urging public and private creditors to complete a renegotiation of Chad's loans by the end of March. This will be critical to restoring the sustainability of the nation's debt. Creditors like mining giant Glencore have been asked to agree on the restructuring of Chad's debt on the same terms as those reached with its official creditors under a G20 debt relief initiative. About a third of Chad's public external debt is owed to Glencore and other commercial lenders. The Central African country, which has little access to global capital markets, tapped Glencore in 2013 and 2014 for nearly $1.85 billion in 2 deals. In Egypt, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic affected key sectors of the country. Some companies, such as Egypt's Nile Air Company, are now picking up after periods of pandemic-induced closure and near liquidation. CGTN's Yasser Hakim has more from Cairo.
The travel and hospitality industry in Egypt has been the sector that's hardest hit by the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. Tourist arrivals and occupancy rates had dropped by over 80% in 2020 and in parts of 2021, dealing a huge blow to the industry, which is a main source of hard currency for the North African nation. Nile Air, a local private sector airline company, was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy in late 2020 due to the global travel restrictions at the time. The management, led by CEO Yusri Abdelwahab, had to take quick action to avoid the worst.
When you have 10 grounded planes that are served by 1,000 employees, obviously, in these circumstances, there are jobs we will not need. We did not fire any workers, but we reduced salaries of our employees. Those whose contracts ended, we told them to wait till things returned to normal before we offered them new contracts. We renegotiated with debtors such as companies that leased us their planes, maintenance companies, and the GBS ticketing firms. The losses were in the millions, so we had to go through an extensive restructuring process.
The Central Bank of Egypt had provided hundreds of millions of dollars in emergency relief funds for state-owned airlines. Although the private sector was allowed to join in flights to evacuate Egyptians abroad during global lockdown, Nile Air CEO Yusri Abdelwahab says they were expecting much more, especially after the pandemic left their businesses on the brink of closure.
معالي السيد وزير الطيران المصري
The Minister of Aviation waived all fees that we owed authorities, as there were orders from the President to support the Egyptian airlines. The state said it will provide loans to us, as well as logistical support. We have called on the Minister of Aviation several times for support, and we are still awaiting the response till now. He gave full support to the state-owned companies, but the private sector is still waiting for concrete steps as promised.
الإجابات لغاية دلوقتي يمكن هو بالفعل وقف مع الشركات الحكومية.
The government recently announced it is preparing a raft of aid packages for the stricken companies. As the end-of-year festivities pick up and prospects of improved businesses in 2022, Abdelwahab is cautiously optimistic. He hopes the COVID-19 and its variants are well contained so he could keep his planes in the skies. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
The online gig business in Kenya is making big strides as more businesses turn to the online space to boost income and expand growth. From employment to service delivery, the online gig is also expected to grow in Africa, lending structure and formality to the growing gig platforms. CGTN's Nick Mudima with more.
Increasingly, more and more people across Kenya, as in around the world, are turning into online platforms to earn a living by offering a service, be it apps such as ride-hailing, food delivery, holiday destinations, car rental, and influencer marketing. The total size of the online Kenyan gig economy as of 2019 is $109 million, employing 36,500 573 gig workers, according to the latest study by Mercycorps. Now, the ride-hailing and online professional work platforms account for the largest portion of the online gig economy by both value and number of workers, according to the report. Now, Kenya's online gig economy is expected to grow by 33% over the next 5 years to $345 million in 2023, employing a total of 93,875 gig workers, representing a growth rate of 27%. Now, Africa is primed to milk this opportunity. A young population, improved connectivity to the internet, two ingredients that will be key to tapping the gig economy to create jobs for economic growth. The aging workforce across Europe and the US, as well as the high cost of labor elsewhere, further positions Africa working age population as prime beneficiary of the globalized digital operations. It's back to you.
And we're not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Here's what's ahead. In sports, Nigeria and Egypt go through to the last 16 of the ongoing Africa Cup of Nations in Cameroon.